Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and completely deconstruct a piece of American history that, well, you probably think you already know inside and out. We're looking at the Oregon Trail. For over a century, this 2,000-mile route has been the absolute ultimate symbol of American frontier grit, right? But as we unpack the primary sources today, you're going to see that the popular narrative we've all been sold, it's actually a carefully constructed myth. The real Oregon Trail was far more complex, a lot more crowded, and honestly, way more fascinating than the legends suggest. Let's get right into why this myth has stuck around for so long. Now, if you're like most millennials or Gen Xers, your memories of the Oregon Trail are probably totally dominated by a certain retro computer game. You know the one. You probably remember just staring at a glowing screen, constantly starving to death, breaking your wagon axle, or falling hopelessly ill in the middle of some lonely, desolate wilderness. And you wouldn't be alone. That iconic phrase, "you have died of dysentery," is practically burned into our cultural consciousness. But here's the kicker. The actual historical data paints a wildly different picture of this journey. The divide between the game and reality is actually staggering. Despite the trail's reputation for death just lurking around every single corner, historical estimates show that 90 to 96% of travelers actually survived the trek. Let me repeat that. An overwhelming 93%, on average, made it through alive. It turns out real pioneers were significantly better at staying alive than, say, a 10-year-old playing a computer game in a school lab. Now, that definitely doesn't mean the trip was easy. Not at all. But it does mean the journey was fundamentally survivable for the vast majority of people who took it on. So, what does this all mean? The crucial point here is that when tragedy did actually strike, it wasn't typically from starvation or those Hollywood-style skirmishes you see in movies. The single most dreaded threat out there was disease, specifically cholera. It could sweep right through a wagon train and kill a perfectly healthy person in a matter of hours. Terrifying, right? The other major causes of death were, well, completely mundane, but utterly devastating accidents. We're talking about folks drowning at treacherous river crossings, accidental firearm discharges just because someone wasn't paying attention, or simply tripping and being crushed by heavy wagon wheels. And this gap between myth and reality, it totally extends to who was actually making the trip, too. The pop culture image of a ragged, desperate individualist striking out completely alone ignores the economic reality of the 19th century. Hollywood absolutely loves to show impoverished people fleeing west for a free chance at survival. But the historical reality? The typical overlanders were what historians call peasant proprietors. These were established, middle-class landowners. People who had spent literally years saving up money to travel together as highly organized family units, because taking the trail was an incredibly expensive venture. To put that expense into perspective for you, outfitting just one family with a wagon, tools, and hundreds of pounds of food, we're talking the recommended 200 pounds of flour and 150 pounds of bacon, cost around $800 to $1,200 back in 1850. Translate that to today's money, you are looking at a staggering $32,000 to $48,000. No joke. This was a massive financial barrier. The poorest folks in the United States simply, physically could not afford to take the Oregon Trail. Furthermore, even the physical image we have in our heads of how they traveled is usually just wrong. Pioneers did not ride in those massive, heavy Conestoga wagons pulled by horses. You know, the big boat-like ones? Those were strictly for freight on the East Coast. They were way too heavy for a 2,000-mile cross-country trip. Instead, they used much lighter, nimbler vehicles called prairie schooners. They got that name because their white canvas tops kind of looked like ship sails off in the distance. And they weren't pulled by horses. They were primarily pulled by oxen. Plus, to spare those animals the extra weight, most pioneers didn't even ride inside. They usually walked on foot for the entire multi-month journey. Just as our mental image of the wagons is totally flawed, so is our timeline of the route itself. The Oregon Trail wasn't just magically invented out of thin air in the 1840s. It actually originated from an ancient, established network of indigenous footpaths. Those were later utilized by British, French, and American fur trappers back in the 1810s. By the time we hit the 1840s up to the 1860s, it had transformed into a massively congested highway for over 400,000 immigrants. Then, the whole era just came to an abrupt close in 1869 with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which basically made the grueling wagon trip obsolete overnight. So as all that traffic peaked, the actual environment of the trail changed drastically. The myth of isolation tells us it was the single, lonely dirt path cutting through pristine, untouched wilderness, but the reality? It was a highly managed, incredibly dynamic logistical highway. It was this moving web of shifting ruts. Honestly, you couldn't travel a single mile during the peak years without seeing other people. The trail was actually defined by private trading posts, toll bridges, and get this, literal, intense wagon traffic jams at major river crossings and forts. Can you imagine a traffic jam in the 1850s? Because the trail was so incredibly crowded, pioneers had to get creative. They actually developed a makeshift postal system that became known as the Bone Express. They would write messages, warnings, advertisements, and yeah, even love letters on animal bones, especially buffalo skulls, and just leave them right by the side of the trail. This ingenious system let them communicate with wagon trains that were traveling days behind them. It was quite literally an information highway built out of bone and debris, which just goes to show exactly how interconnected these travelers really were. Far from braving total, uncharted wilderness, these travelers actually relied deeply on a commercialized capitalist system. The trail was literally lined with private ferry operations and toll roads. Emigrants passed through military forts, places where hundreds of people and draft animals checked in every single day. They relied heavily on Mormon cooperatives for fresh supplies. And by 1861, there were telegraph lines running the entire length of the trail. If you took a detour into Salt Lake City in the 1850s, you could even visit barber shops and bathhouses. This was a heavily managed, highly subsidized infrastructure, not the wild unknown. Today, thankfully, we are finally starting to correct the historical record. Organizations like the Bureau of Land Management, right alongside local heritage museums all across the West, are actively using primary source diaries to unpack these myths. Institutions are fiercely dedicated to preserving the actual physical ruts of the trail, and this matters immensely. Being able to literally see the physical scars of this massive logistical operation carved into the landscape today, it connects us directly to the truth. It allows us to present a way more inclusive and accurate narrative that completely shatters that simplified 19th century folklore. Which brings us to the biggest question of this whole explainer. If the reality was a heavily managed, super crowded highway, why on earth does the myth of the rugged, isolated pioneer persist? Well, it persists because it provides a highly convenient, very heroic narrative. It promotes that uniquely American ideal of the rugged individualist who built a life out of absolutely nothing, but in doing so, it intentionally erases the settlers' massive reliance on federal subsidies, military protection, and corporate infrastructure. Furthermore, it successfully masks the much darker realities of Western expansion, like the systematic displacement of indigenous populations and legislation that explicitly excluded Black Americans and single women from owning the very land they traveled so far to claim. Your absolute biggest takeaway here should be this. The real pioneers succeeded through pooling their resources and relying on networked logistics. Survival required complex coordination and strict community discipline. Ironically, the frontier tales we love to repeat today, the ones about going it alone, dismissing expertise, and just flying by the seat of your pants, those tales actually reward the exact behaviors that made real journeys on the Oregon Trail end in total failure. Preparation and community shaped outcomes far, far more than individual toughness ever could. As we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a thought from historian Dr. Elias Hawthorne. He says, myths simplify a complex system into a single heroic character. The Oregon Trail was absolutely not an empty wilderness conquered by a few lone wolves. It was a massive, networked operation of policy, logistics, and shared labor. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. If our most cherished adventurous history is actually just a simplified legend, what other American myths are hiding a much more fascinating, complex, and deeply connected reality? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.